Hello guys, Jacob here, and I want to address some comments made against my video in which I address the immorality of the LGBTQ political agenda. And in that video, I cited a source called Science Daily. And it's obvious that I wasn't trying to hide anything about this source, given that I told you that I got it from Science Daily. And all one needed to do to be able to find this source is simply Google Science Daily homosexuality, and it would be the first article to pop up. Okay. Now, in this website, it says most scientists agree that it is unlikely that there is a single gay gene that determines something as complex as sexual orientation, and that it is more likely to be the result of an interaction of genetic, biological, and environmental cultural factors. Okay, so it's saying that most scientists, most of the studies conducted show that homosexuality is the result of an interaction of one's biology with environmental and cultural factors. And there are other articles that show this. It's saying that the biology is dependent on environmental and cultural factors. Notice how it's not saying that it's dependent on biological or environmental and cultural factors, or it's not saying that homosexuality is the result of biological and or environmental and cultural factors. It's saying that it is the result, according to most scientists, of environmental and cultural factors and the biology. Now, what I'm not saying is that it's a choice. I'm not saying that it is a choice. Just like someone being addicted to nicotine and smoking isn't a choice. Some people are just naturally inclined to be addicted to these substances. Just as an analogy, in that video, I was basically arguing that if we remove, for example, the nicotine or the cigarette from the individual's life, if it was never introduced, okay, this cigarette representing environmental and cultural factors, if it was never introduced to the individual who is naturally inclined and addicted to the substance, then this individual would not become addicted, or at least he wouldn't be introduced to the substance, which would lead to their addiction. But what I do believe in is the cultural and environmental conditioning of one's biology, which I believe is self-evident. I mean, based on where you will live, based on your culture, your community, and even your social groups, could determine your preferences in life. They could determine your likes and your dislikes. Growing up in a rural area compared to an urban area or to anywhere else could change what you like or dislike. For example, if you grew up in India, you'll most likely like Indian food or Indian music or Indian clothing. Okay, if you grew up in Mexico, you'll most likely like Mexican food or Mexican clothing or Mexican music. If you grew up in America, depending on where you grow up, you'll like that community's food, clothing, or music. It's all based on what you're introduced to. That's not saying that you can't like, another culture's goods or what they have to offer, but more than likely you'll have a preference towards your cultural surroundings based on what you were conditioned to like or what you were introduced to and were conditioned to perceive as being preferable. You know what they say, there's nothing like being at home. When it comes to the morality of it, like I established in my video, why atheism can only logically lead to nihilism, there are no objective standards of morality. That's to say that there is no independent standard which exists beyond the human perception, which determines absolute or objective right and wrong. If you simply Google objectivism, the definition of objectivism is the belief that certain things especially moral truths, exist independently of human knowledge or perception of them. So that's to say that something is wrong whether or not we as individuals perceive it to be wrong. For example, Hitler and his Nazi regime, committing the Holocaust was wrong whether or not Hitler and his henchmen believed it to be wrong. The only way that objective truths can exist is if there is a higher mind, a higher truth that exists beyond human perception. And in atheism, everything comes down to natural processes. Okay? So there is no higher standard above nature. So that's why I was trying to give a secular argument against the LGBTQ agenda. Now, an atheist can believe in objective truths, but it wouldn't be based on anything, okay? And so what I was doing in that video to argue against the LGBTQ agenda was provide some of the same reasons that atheists use to say that we do have good reason to be moral, all right? And that has to do with our evolution and how we evolved to be empathetic and emotional beings. Using that same logic, we can say that murder and violence are natural phenomenon, which is the result of our evolution, and therefore those things are justified. Now, I make a comprehensive argument against this idea that empathy can be an objective standard for morality in my video, which I called Why Atheism Can Only Logically Lead to Nihilism. But that's beyond the point of this video. But using that same line of reasoning, based on how we evolved, based on survival of the fittest, I gave 2 points why pushing the LGBTQ agenda is wrong. It's wrong because it can introduce more factors and more elements which can induce a child's sexual preference. It can help to condition their preference of being homosexual. Okay, so the first point I bring up is that it does endanger our children, especially in our current cultural climate where homosexuality is persecuted, where children who are openly homosexual are persecuted and have a higher tendency to commit suicide. This is just the reality of things, okay? And it's based on our culture. It doesn't matter how I feel about it, and it doesn't matter how you feel about it. The fact is that there are children out there being bullied and persecuted for coming out as being homosexual. Okay. Now, the second point is that it can possibly lead to our genes not being passed down, given that most homosexuals do not reproduce. They're less likely to pass on our DNA, our genes, to the next generation, which is not good for us in terms of survival of the fittest. According to an article found on BBC titled, "Are There Any Homosexual Animals?" an author quotes some biologists, and it states, Solive and Vassie still say that humans are the only documented case of true homosexuality in wild animals. It is not the case that you have lesbian bonobos or gay male bonobos, says Vassie. What's been described is that many animals are happy to engage in sex with partners of either sex. So we have in the wild every other animal, every other documented case of homosexuality in nature is usually conducted between bisexual animals. I mean, animals in nature are inclined to either have sex with male or female. They're not prejudiced. They don't have really a preference, okay, because we can see that they engage in both forms of sex. So if there was a natural biological factor for true homosexuality as seen in humans, where a homosexual only prefers those of their own sex, it would be seen in the wild. But it's not. All other wild animals who show homosexual tendencies are bisexual. They're bisexual. They have no problem being with the other sex. On the website called visionandvalues.org, an article can be found titled Environmental Factors May Influence Sexual Orientation. Okay, and in this article, I'm just going to give you some quotes, but it confirms my original theory in this video, and that's that homosexuality is conditioned. It's conditioned by environmental and cultural factors. Okay, so according to this article, it says Danish researchers have studied over 2 million men and women. And in their study, they found that there are environmental factors that can influence the probability of a child to be homosexual. Okay, so the researchers found for each additional year one's parents stay married, the probability of heterosexual marriage in the children increased by 1.6% amongst sons and 1% amongst daughters. So in heterosexual marriages, in which the marriage lasts long, there is a less likelihood that your child will be homosexual for each additional year in that marriage. In contrast, the rate of homosexual unions decreased by 1.8% amongst sons and 1.4% amongst daughters for every year of intact parental marriages. Okay. Regarding homosexual marriages, the researchers found that birthplace relates to the sexual orientation of marriage partners. Being born in urban settings increased the probability of homosexual marriage and decreased the probability of heterosexual marriage. So, as you can see, that it is, primarily, I believe, the result of environmental and cultural factors based on where you grow up and other environmental influences in your culture and where you grow up. Okay, it even relates to how many brothers or sisters you have. If you have more brothers, the more likelihood that you'll be heterosexual. Okay, so it's conditioned early on in your life. Now, before I end this video, I just want to say that I'm not hating on homosexuals. I'm not condemning homosexuals. I actually feel empathetic towards them. I've had friends who were homosexuals who, they left me because I have strong Christian moral views. And I feel sorry for them because I don't believe that the truth or that God is on their side. And I'd much rather have them, come to God, ask for forgiveness, and for God to change their hearts. Because none of us are perfect. None of us are perfect. We all have sins that we struggle with. Okay, so you have a blessed day, and I hope this video helped to clarify my point of view.